More companies are extending their work-from-home policies, saving money in the process. But that savings comes at a cost to other businesses in the neighborhood. NBC News technology correspondent Jacob Ward spoke with one CEO who's giving up their office altogether.
Packing up is emotional.
And you start looking in drawers and taking things out and putting things in boxes. It becomes very nostalgic. You know, we've been here for 25 years. This has been our life. And to go from having a 4,500 square foot office with all these employees running around and the excitement and all of that that's created to going remote is very, very scary.
John Gumas's 15-person staff had to work from home during the pandemic. So even he was surprised when he and his whole staff turned out to like going remote. Now he's putting the office up for rent.
What will you save by not having to run this place?
It's probably about 30 to 35% of our operating budget every month is because of a physical building.
And you'll just cut that out?
We'll just cut that out. This was one of the few areas.
But the savings for Gumas come at a cost to other businesses in the neighborhood.
So this is what, your lunch spot?
This is our lunch spot. This is where we come every single day and have lunch, have coffee, have them deliver sandwiches to the office. So it's going to be kind of sad.
The Flying Pig Bistro has been reduced to doing only takeout lunch orders since mid-March.
A lot of the locals were really people who worked close by rather than live close by, so those people are all gone.
What does it mean, do you think, when companies like that decide, okay, we're just going to give up on a neighborhood and just work from home from now on?
I mean, they got to, decide what's right for them, but of course, we're going to miss them.
Now imagine how many dominoes will fall if an entire downtown office building empties out.
That's happening across San Francisco. Twitter was the first to say some employees can work remotely forever. Google and Facebook will let most employees work from home through at least June of 2021. And now Slack, the messaging platform, says its people will work from home from now on.
Do you feel sort of guilty at all about sort of punching a little bit of a hole in the urban fabric here?
Oh, yeah. Not only do I feel guilty, I'm scared. All right, once we leave, it's hard to come back.
Jake joins me now from San Francisco. Jake, that's a great story. Personally, my dad's company also just did the same thing. It's happening in a lot of places. You touched on the ripples that could move through the economy as offices empty out and stay that way. Are we seeing any of those effects already?
Well, hi, Savannah. Absolutely. In fact, this morning we got word that the first dominoes had fallen for a service workers union, food service workers, that employs about 3,500 people serving Silicon Valley. So I'm actually standing right now at a place we just arrived in Sunnyvale, where behind me, the Yahoo headquarters, now owned by Verizon, has in fact laid off about 91 food service workers. They're the first of their union to be laid off. Now, I should mention that Verizon does not directly employ them. They're employed by a company, a subcontractor. But these people have been laid off pretty much without warning and are now showing up in a symbolic protest to fill out their unemployment paperwork here in front of the building. We spoke to one of them, Augustina Sanchez, who says she's worked in that building for 12 years and just learned that she'd been laid off by mail. I asked her what her financial situation is going to look like on unemployment.
We are going to apply for unemployment, but it's not enough, the unemployment, for my pay rent and bills. I think we are going to need another job. But at this time and this situation, we are living, everybody, it's not enough for us, for me and my co-workers.
Savannah, you can just hear the anguish in her voice, and we can see behind us children, families here trying to sort out what their next steps will be. Now, Google and Facebook, who also employ people from that workers' union, have said in the past that they're going to continue to support them, continue to employ them. But these are really the first dominoes that we've seen falling as buildings like this, and all around me, these buildings are empty, have remained empty for so long and may continue to do so, Savannah.
Oh, it's just heartbreaking to hear some of those personal stories and how it's affecting these families. What do we know about how long companies think they'll keep their employees at home? I mean, are people ever coming back? Are any companies planning for that? And then ultimately, what would the financial effects of that be?
Well, a new study that just came out from the Conference Board, which is a think tank of executives, polled top-level executives across the country, and they said about 35% of them had no idea, Savannah, when they were going to come back to an office. And new research out commissioned by Slack, the messaging company, has found that only about 12% of knowledge workers specifically, the kind of people who work in buildings like these, would ever come back to a full-time in-office situation. So we're talking here about, not just a short-term effect. This could be a long-term effect. And as you can see in the people behind us, it's going to have this tremendous upheaval in their financial security. So we're seeing the ripple effects, the dominoes, beginning to fall across the American economy, Savannah.
We are, Jacob, and it is tough to see. Thanks so much.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.